Greetings and welcome to this episode of Let's Create Something with Trapcode TAO. And today we're going to be creating this cool abstract looping shiny pearls animation together. And in this episode I'm going to try to keep it a little bit short and sweet, much more straight to the basic than perhaps usually. So we're not going to go deep crazy on expressions today. And I'm going to try to look more in detail at some of the features that I skipped over most of the time in my little Trapcode TAO sessions. So let's try to create something like that from the start. So we're going to start by creating a new composition, and let's make this one 1080 by 1080. Let's call this TAO Pearls. All right, brand new canvas. Let's start as we always do by creating a new solid. So Control Y. And let's call this TAO. And let's go ahead and apply our beloved effect, Trapcode TAO, from the effect panel. So let's simply double click here while we have our solid selected. And there we have our automatically generated path. Usually we don't use that, but in this episode, it'll be entirely based on that. So we're not going to go and create any light objects. Let's look at the fractal. Let's select the fractal the automatically generated path with the fractal setting. So this is what we get with most default settings here. We can increase or decrease its size, and basically it's just a fractally created path. So our path is not a line, it's not a circle, it's not a line, but instead it's a path that's the result of some fractal displacement in the 3D space there. So few settings that we have here. We can of course rotate around that and offset it in the 3D space, but also we can choose if we want to work with a closed path. So let's check that, and automatically it'll close down the path for our fractal shape there. And we have the length. So the length will make our overall path a lot longer, but as soon as we start to increase that, we'll want to go down to the segment and make sure that we increase the segment to make sure that we have enough geometry to actually represent the whole length of this path. But let's keep it down to 3 for this, and of course let's get back to the default settings. So right click and reset here to make it back to the default 25 segments. All right, next settings we have the complexity, and maybe this is going to be more obvious with more segments, but this will affect the overall complexity in our path. But let's also keep that at the default settings for the moment. Next we have Fractal Evolution, which is more really interesting there. So this will offset the displacement which our generated path will follow in an animated fashion. So right there we'll go back to 25 segments, and yeah, this is something that we can keyframe to have an animation result out of that. So let's keyframe that. Let's make a keyframe on the frame 0, and let's click on the stopwatch here on Fractal Evolution, and let's go a little bit further in time, right at frame 90 here. This is the 3-second mark. 3 times 30 frames, so 1 second. If you're working in 30 frames per second, that's 3 seconds. Let's hit page up to go back 1 frame at frame 89, and hit N to close down our work area. So this will be the space and time we use in our timeline for the preview that we watch. And let's hit U now that we've created our keyframe. That will reveal any keyframed properties. And let's go back to frame 90. So page down here, go up 1 frame, and I'm gonna simply increase the value of that. If we preview that, it's gonna animate our basic shape along the fractal displacement. All right, so our last frame looks like this, and our first frame looks like this, so it's not gonna loop for the moment, but with that, it's really an easy task to make it loop. So the next setting is what we're gonna use to make sure that it loops. So any time that we put in here. If it's 3 seconds, if it's 6 minutes, if it's any duration. It depends on the amount of evolution that we have. So right here, we randomly just scrambled this amount to 4.39. So let's just copy the value that we have on the last frame here, and let's set the fractal evolution loop to that. We don't keyframe this one. We just set this to be our loop point in time. So now if I preview that, we're going to have something that seamlessly loops. As it goes to the last frame, it's going to come back to the first frame, and it's going to go on and do that endlessly without any cuts or without any hiccups or skips. It's going to be seamless. So now what's to understand here is that any value that we put here, we have to reflect that here. In fact, to be more accurate, is the difference between the value that's on the first frame and the value that's on the last frame. And to keep things easier for us, a good practice to do is always start at 0. So you'll know that the last keyframe that you have here is going to be the value that you punch down here. So let's try to put down 3 here. And since we didn't change the second value yet, are we on frame 90? Yes, we are on frame 90. So right now the first frame will not look like the last one, but if we readjust that, now if we look at the first frame, it's the same. So now we've reduced the speed, the overall speed of our loop. It's still 90 frames, it's still 3 seconds. It's going slower and it's still gonna seamlessly loop. Let's try even slower. So go to the last frame. Let's try 1.5, and let's try that, and we're gonna test it to the limits. So perhaps if we put a value that's too small, it's maybe not gonna work, but it seems that it still do work. Let's start with a value of 3 for both. All right, we have our basic seamlessly looping shape. And always make sure that your last frame is actually the frame 89, because we start at frame 0. That makes 90 frames total. But if we would to play the last frame, it's the same as the first one. So as we come back, we would have kind of a little pause, and in reality we would be dealing with 91 frames. So let's keep that in mind. Next we have the Fractal Evolution offset. So this value, its role is going to be some like a random seed for our fractal path. So now we have our setting, we have our keyframed animation, we have our loop. But if we would want to experiment with different shape of fractal, we can simply scramble that value, and based on the same settings that we've put down here, we're going to get a different visual result. But it's always going to be looping since we've set it up that way. So it's really, really interesting, because right there we can experiment with several different results just by scrambling this. And right until you find the one that you like best. Let's try something like that. All right, let's make them into spheres. So right now we're extruding a path. Now I'm going down in the segment sections, and instead of extrude n-gons for the segment mode, let's set that up to repeat spheres. So what we'll get by default is really low poly spheres. In fact, they only have 3 sides, so let's increase that to 6. And already they're still pretty low poly, but we can see that we're dealing with 25 individual spheres along our fractal path, which is being displaced and is looping seamlessly. Hey, that's pretty neat. So we're up to this point. and there's really not much that we did, and we have so much control on that. So that's excellent. Let's keep it up. Next, so we can always reduce the amount of segments if we feel that we have too many of those spheres there. We can change the amount of segments. And right now they do look really like some 90s low poly graphic, but one quick way that we can make it more smooth is to go down to the rendering properties down there, and instead of flat, let's set the shader to smooth. And already, like, the result we get, they look much smoother. The way the light reflects on it, we've got the little specular here, they look much more like spheres, and we still have the size pretty low. So in fact, it would look even better if we set it to 24 or higher than that. But sometimes when you're working on something, you don't really need, you're just previewing as you're working, you don't really need the end result to judge what you're judging. So it's always best to try to keep it as low as possible, and then when you're publishing the end result, you crank this number back up to make it smoother at the end, at the time of the final render. But now let's work with something that renders really fast and that loops seamlessly. Cool. 8 sides. Seems to work pretty good for us. We can change the size of our segment. Next, what we're going to look at is the randomness. So let's make those pearls, let's make their size vary as they are being drawn along this path. So right there, and we have the randomness section here, which I don't play around that too often in my other sessions, because we've got some other means to add variations to our path with light objects and expressions. But let's keep it simple in there. We're not gonna play around with the random position X or random position Y though, because as we do such, let's test it, it's gonna make some of our spheres pop in and out, and maybe that's not something that I would recommend now that we're using the fractal path. But we're gonna change the random scale, so that's gonna, each time a sphere is getting generated, each time a pearl is getting generating along our path, it'll be drawn at a different scale. So overall they'll be all a different size individually. So that is going to add a little bit more randomness in there, if we can look at that. And now maybe some of them are too big, so we can crank down the overall size of it all and play around with this setting here. We do have a random seed also. We can of course change the scale on X or on Y randomly, but we're in this particular scenario, since we want to reproduce pearls, we're gonna try to keep it proportional. We're not creating rice or jelly beans there, but completely perfect spheres. We have a random seed here, which is again quite similar to what we were doing when we changed the Fractal Evolution offset. So based on the same setting, we're allowed to have different output. Here it's just going to do the same, but just on this random scale that's being applied. So it's going to vary between, based on this same setting here, it's going to give us different results in terms of how they each individually scale up or down over the course of the path. So that's something else that gives us more variations, really easy to work with. Let's make it a real, let's make them a little bit closer together by changing the overall size in the path generator. Next, we're gonna look at this checkbox here, what it does. Unique seeds when repeated, but first let's go down to the repeat path to look at what it's gonna do exactly. So without changing anything, let's start by adding one repetition. So let's type 1 here. And by default, the R1 world position X is set to 100. So what it's doing by default is also the symmetric doubler is checked. So it's creating an instance, two instances of this, of what we already have, and it's offsetting it 100 pixels to the left. And since it's symmetric, it's doing the same on the right as well. If we were to uncheck this, it just makes a copy onto the left. And if we increase that, I mean to the right, I was just inversing both directions here. But if we increase that, then we can select, we can choose how much distance we want between each repetition. In this case, let's keep that to 1, and let's keep that to 0. And we can also rotate this. So we're simply going to keep it right at the same spot, but we're going to give it some rotation to make a little bit more variation. And right now it looks really random and all, but let's get this back to let's look at two instances side to side. So right there, I'm gonna put them side to side. I'm just gonna create a camera, so Control Alt Shift C, and we're gonna work it with a 50mm camera, the default settings, and I'm simply gonna hit C to cycle between the different camera tools and scroll back there, and just move on the side there, so we can look at both our instances side to side. So they are quite similar to each other. In fact, they are exactly the same. So they are twins now. And if we want them to vary as we repeat them, that's what this checkbox is for. So if we check this in, it's going to make a different variation on this one. It's not going to make a variation on the path, but it's going to make a variation on the scale of our thing. And if since we they were identical, but I was at 9 rotated there. Let's uncheck that. So they are actually twins now, since we don't have this checkbox enabled. But as we check this in, and then we can rotate it as well to add a little bit more variation in there. And let's bring them back together, and let's delete our camera. So we're back to this. So as we look at that, we've got our basic fractal motion. It's still seamlessly looping. From the start, we've set it up in that way that we could incrementally work on it and keep it looping. So that's what's really nice working with Trapcode TAO. Let's make a third repetition. Why not? A second to get a third. And this segment size here, perhaps we can make them smaller, the repetition. So if we change the number here, and we're going to try once again to keep it proportional, each time it gets repeated, the spheres will be scaled down by 80%. So that's another feature that we could add to our mass of pearls to get a little bit more variations in there. All right, just one layer, just one effect, no lights, no expressions, and only 2 keyframes for the moment. All right. And one last thing that we can add on to this overall animation to once again add one touch of detail on top of that. Right now they are at different scales. Individually, each sphere are not the same size, but they always keep the same size over time. Let's make something real quick to add an animation on that. So perhaps we're gonna go back to something more basic so we can understand what's going on. So let me explain real quick. We're gonna shut down our repetitions for the moment, right there, and we're also gonna shut down the random scale there, so we have something a little bit more straightforward with less variation in there. And also we're gonna set that to a circle, or we can always go back to a line. That's what we were working with, the fractal, but let's explain. It's gonna be easier to see with a circle or even a line for what we're gonna talk about now. The taper size. So I'm in the path generator. Right now it's a line. We can easily go back to what we have earlier, but let's check in. Let's enable the taper size. So what this is gonna do is by default, it's gonna make the first sphere really small, and gradually it's gonna increase its scale until it gets in the middle of the path, and then it's gonna go again and decrease the scale. So that's something really basic that we can have without adding additional keyframes there. And of course, if we don't want any tapering at the start, we can set that to 0 if we don't want any at the end. But let's not get, and we can animate it along the path. We can keyframe that, but let's keep it even more simple than that. In this particular scenario, we're gonna keep the default settings there. And what we're gonna go look at is the offset. So we're gonna offset that. By default, the offset size is checked, and that's precisely how we want it, because the taper size is what we want to animate along the path. So if we scrub this, it's gonna move our path along. It's gonna move the scaling along the path like such. So let's animate that for the same amount of time as we did for Fractal Evolution. So let's set the first keyframe at 0, and let's set the last keyframe at 100. So that's gonna make, it's gonna start from this point and it's gonna animate it off, but let's check the loop offset here. So basically it's gonna do it over and over again. And once again, that's something that's gonna be seamlessly looping for us. Right. So right now it's easy to understand what it's doing because it's doing it along a simple line, but let's go and do it along a circle, and that's how it would go. So as we will put our settings back, it's gonna do that kind of stuff along the path of our fractal while it's moving. So this is with no repetition. And just to make sure that you have a better feel of this, let me just temporarily hit U to reveal the keyframe, and let me just shut down the Fractal Evolution for the moment and add more segments back there. We're gonna have a little bit more like a pearl necklace there. So that's what we're getting right now. The evolution is not on, so we're getting some scaling of each individual sphere gradually along our fractal path. But yeah, we're moving our path at the same time, and it's looping, and it was looping at 3, I think. That's what we were, yeah. So now with this much segment, it's gonna make it go like that. But in our case, we did have only 8, or maybe more than that. Maybe let's try that 16. I don't remember what we had. Let's undo 14. That's what we had. So let's go back to 14. And let's re-enable our repetitions. So right there we had 2. And let's look at our motion. Oh, and let's also set back the random scale there. So we get each of them at a different scale. And there we go. We have our loop. So a little bit much is going on now. Maybe we can change the seed for the scale. Maybe we can bring it up a little bit and bring this down to random. Get a little bit less of that. And maybe on the repetition, also change the angle of rotation to get some different results, and perhaps add a little bit of random position in there. There. We can offset a little bit, doesn't hurt. And that's what we're getting now. It's quite fast. Let's try a different offset for the path. So let's try this. They look a little bit more closer together. Maybe that's best for us. And let's decrease the evolution. So instead of 2, instead of 3, let's try 2. We're on the last keyframe. And let's set back the fractal evolution loop to 2, so it follows this value. And there we have it, a little bit slower. Cool. That's cool. All right, now that we have that, let's work on the final looks. So let's add a background, Control Y for a new solid, and let's get some kind of a beige color, maybe. Not that you can't put any color that you want there, but what I want to explain to you right here, I know I said no expression, but we're simply gonna link something to something. So this solid here, let's add a fill effect here from the effect and preset panel, and this is gonna make it all red because it simply applies a straight color onto the solid, and we only want that to get the same color that we've choose for our solid here by clicking on this little icon there. And the reason we're doing that is simply we can get something to link our fog color off. So let's hit E. That's going to reveal our fill effect here, and let's drag this down here so we have this visible here, the color. And let's go to our TAO there, and in TAO let's go down to the visibility settings, and first let's check how far we're going with this. So with the far setting, let's drag down until we start to see our balls disappear there. So we know that we're not really much further than 2000. Let's give us some padding. So 3000 for the depth is no more than what we need. And let's copy this value and let's paste it in the fog end. And for the fog start now, we can put something that's lower. So let's drag this down. And as I drag this down now, the fog is white. So let's make it the same as our background color, and let's make it follow. So we're gonna link it to it. We're gonna alt click on the stopwatch of the fog color. And right here, we're gonna pull on the pick whip here, the little spiral, and we're simply gonna choose the color from the fill effect of the solid. So now, let me just pull that in. So we're getting this background color to bleed on the spheres, but not on the ones that are on the front, just the ones that are further back. So this makes it look a little bit more that it's sitting there. It's a little bit better integrated with the background. And what we did there, linking it, will allow us to change the color of the background. So if we were to put anything else here, it would follow for the fog there. So that's something that you can always work around with. Let's go back to this kind of look there. And right now they're still too low poly, and they look, there's no detail in, they don't reflect anything, so they look like just like boring, dull spheres. Let's change that, and let's do that quite easily. First, let's crank a little bit the amount of sides. So let's set that to at least 24. Get something that's a little bit smoother, or maybe 36 there. Just trying to get some smooth edge and not handicap the preview speed there. So it's still rendering pretty fast. And let's get down to the material and the lighting. So let me close down some of those sections there that we're not using anymore. And let's go to the material and lighting. And let's twirl down the image-based lighting. So we're going to use a built-in environment for this one. We can use our custom, but you can look at on other of my tutorials. I explained that in detail. In this session, we're going to use a pre-built one. So we're going to use the church interior. And by default, that's what this is going to do. It's going to apply a 360 environment on those spheres, and each of them are going to reflect this environment. So we can change a little bit the exposure of that, and we can rotate this environment. So if we do that, you'll see the angle that reflects in the sphere will change. And what we're doing with this, in fact, is we're choosing the angle at which the light hits the sphere. So right there, we have some windows there on the top right. That's makes some light coming through that direction, and a little bit from those windows on the left side. So I like how this feels overall. I'm going to keep it like that for the moment. And 100% reflection. Now they look like chrome. Pearls are a little bit less reflective than that, so I'm going to pull down this number there, and now they're getting too dark, so we're going to increase the diffuse strength. Something around 200 might do it, depending on what you're after there. And already this looks much more like spheres there. Perhaps we can also increase the Fresnel there to make the reflection even more subtle in our pearls there. So it's all about subtlety. So work it up until you get something that looks as you like. And we're almost there. We're doing it. Of course, you can always change the basic color for your material through this settings here. If we want to make them a little bit darker easily, that's how we can do it. But let's keep them pure white for the moment. And yeah, to further enhance that, the last steps we can do is maybe get back to the rendering settings here. And since now we have an SIBL, an image-based lighting, sometimes it's best to change to a super sample instead of multi-sample. So let me go down to 16 times here, super sample. And it's not going to be obvious, especially with the compression of YouTube here, but let's focus on the creases here where we have our shadow. So if it's set to off here, sometimes you have some kind of white noise and where you have contacts, but setting it to 16x will fix that a little bit. Pretty nice. Next, what we can do is play around with the contact shadow. So here is our ambient occlusion right there. If we turn it off, we don't have any shadow at all there. So let's undo. This is the default settings. They are there for a reason. They will have the most chance of looking right with anything that you create, but sometimes you have to tweak that because elements that you build are larger or smaller than what intended with the default. So usually what I do is I choose a frame first to look at what I'm gonna play around, and I take a screenshot. So Shift F8 to take a picture, and now I'm gonna play around with those. So let's increase the AO scale maybe to basically perhaps I just want the shadows to spill a little bit further, but not to be quite too intense. So if I were to increase the intensity, this is too much. It looks fake. We really want to be subtle with that. So let's increase the AO scale a bit, maybe increase the radius, and then increase the intensity. So we're going a little further, and we can always hit F8 to compare. So right now I like F8 better. It's too present. Let's lift it a little bit. So we really don't want too much in there. We just want slight shadow. So this should do it. Something like that. Perhaps it's a little bit better than the default, because as they get further from each other, we'll still have some shadow mass appearing on the sides of our spheres. So let's not go overboard with this, but always keep in mind that you can tweak those settings there in the end. Right, we're almost there. Let's look at how to cheat a little shadow. So we're not gonna project a true shadow. We're just gonna make something that's gonna act as a shadow, and that's not gonna be too complicated for us to make. Once we've made it like that, we're satisfied right there. So let's duplicate our solid here, and now that we have a second instance, usually I would recommend pre-comping it, but since we have linked this with an expression and it's not quite heavy on the processing, we can simply duplicate an instance there. So we have another one in the back, and what I did here is simply hide the one on top, and the one underneath, what we're gonna do is, we have it there, we're gonna add a fill effect. So let's drag it right there, and red is not the color that we want, but black. Let's make it 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 100% black, and let's turn this back on. So this is what we're gonna use to act as a shadow, but we want to change the perspective of that, and one quick easy way we can do that, and this is cheating, yes it is. So let's get the corner pin effect. Corner pin, it's in the distort, and let's drag it underneath our fill effect. So now I have the layer controls invisible, so Control Shift H to reveal those, and since I have the corner pin selected here, I have some settings, some corners here I can drag while we have the effect selected, of course, that I can drag here to create some sense of perspective here. Really fake one, but not much more than what we need to sell our little loop there. So let's bring back our TAO effect, and let's move our shadow. So let's try to pull those down, and let's just try to simulate some kind of a perspective there. And let's play it back to see. It's just gonna give an idea that it's hovering above something. It's not gonna be true perfect shadow. Actually, it looks maybe quite fake depending on how you can bring the corner pins to give you a nice angle on that. But really the idea here is not to make it realistic, it's just to make it look better than if it was just with no shadow. So nothing too complicated there. And of course, right, it's too sharp, so we want to add some blur on that, and also we want to hit T to lower down the opacity of it, and perhaps even change the blending mode to multiply there. So already looking much better. And let's add some fast box blur onto that, and if we increase that, we can soften the shadow quite a bit, and making sure that it doesn't look as crisp. It's just subtly there, a shadow underneath our pearls, shiny pearls. And that's our end result. So you see the shadow, since it's quite angled, it gives us a little bit more perspective. It actually follows the sphere, so makes it a little bit more interesting. But as you would guess, it's always about the tweak, so sometimes maybe you have to move it a little bit. And really it's about our main pearls here that are perhaps not at all centered, but once again, just a matter of little tweaks there. Let's get in world transform, and maybe we can bring this up a little bit. And yeah, we don't necessarily need to change the other one, but let's look at that. And yeah, already we have this thing, and it looks a little bit more interesting because it kind of seems like it hovers above a surface. Cool. Let's add a camera. Control-Alt-Shift-C. And maybe we need to zoom back a little bit. So let's do that. And now we might have to adjust our fog. So let's get in this TAO effect. And let's bring our fog further. Since we pulled back the camera, now we need to see more further for those spheres in the back not to be too blended with the background. All right. So there we have it, a fun little loop that didn't take too much time to put in place, and you can always experiment further with that. Let's add ourselves an adjustment layer. Just for the last touch, we're gonna simply boost the contrast on that, just to make it seem a little bit more crisp for the eye there. And it's not like Cinema 4D Octane output quality, but really it just does fool the eye with something that looks kind of detailed and quite fun. And the beauty of it is not too long to render. So let's decrease the now that I've boosted the contrast, the intensity of the contact shadow is too much for my liking. Maybe it just needs to be a little wider. So always in the end, play around with that, and when you're done, simply hit render and we have a loop. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. As always, I'm more than curious to see what you will create on your own, what variations you'll put in there, and there's always someone that creates some things that really surprises me. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you very much for watching, and as always, see you next time.